Well, I guess this was bound to happen sooner or later, but it doesn't make the reality of it suck any less. For those of you who may have been completely offline for the last week, on the 1st of July 2026, Sony dropped the bomb that as of the beginning of 2028, they would be ceasing production on all disc releases for games on their platforms going forward. This includes all PS5 releases of games coming out after that date, and all but confirmed that the inevitable PlayStation 6 will be a digital-only console before it's even been formally announced. This news also coincided with them announcing that the PS3 and PS Vita digital storefronts would also be getting shut down later this year, and only a week after the news that one of the most anticipated releases of the decade, Grand Theft Auto 6, would only be seeing a physical release in the form of a code in a box. Whether or not those two things have anything to do with each other can only be left up to speculation, but it sure is convenient. All of this news has naturally gone down like a lead balloon, and people have spent the last week in a frenzy throwing shots at both Rockstar and Sony. From your run-of-the-mill gamers, to game developers, to special release vendors, to journalists, to the social media intern for Domino's Pizza. Millions of people coming together in a collective uproar to say, "What the fuck are you doing?" And it's been a beautiful sight to see, but sadly one that's likely going to fall on deaf ears. I hope to any god who will listen that this video ages poorly and the massive outcry makes them backpedal in some way, but I'm pretty sure they're digging in their heels with this one. This is one of the few things I feel I need to talk on and strike while the iron is hot, so you'll have to forgive me for the minimal editing job here. I wanted to personally weigh in on this topic, because physical games as a concept is something near and dear to me and many others. So let's get a bit of an introduction here. I'm Nat, or you can call me Blue. I've been gaming since I was 3 years old, and the first console my family had was the original Sony PlayStation, which we got back in 1996, along with Destruction Derby 2, Ridge Racer Revolution, and the one I pretty much exclusively played, Crash Bandicoot. This right here was my gateway to this hobby. I adored this game. I know it inside out, top to bottom, and I could play it front to back and get 100% in one sitting. And to this day, 30 years later, I can still do that. I own this game on about every platform it was released on. I got it digitally on PS3 and PS Vita, I bought the Insane Trilogy on PS4 and PC, but most importantly, I still have that PS1 disc sitting on my shelf whenever I want to boot it up for old time's sake. And that original disc is especially important here, because in case you're not aware, the PS1 version of this game, and all of the other Naughty Dog Crash games for that matter, have never been officially re-released anywhere since the Vita. And with the news of the PS3 and Vita stores being shut down at the end of the year, there's not going to be any way to legally buy that original version anymore. You're either going to have to shell out for a physical pre-owned copy, or more likely play it on an emulator. Now, some people may say, well, we still have the Insane Trilogy to fall back on, that's still easily available on all modern platforms, and it's better than the PS1 versions anyway. To which I say, wrong! This is a sticking point of preservation efforts that I hate to see regurgitated. The idea that a remake can just replace the original and we have no need for that crusty old thing now that we have the shiny new thing. Art is not just some toy to be upgraded and replaced. And as for the people saying Insane Trilogy is better than the PS1 versions to the point they're an easy replacement, I wager most of you motherfuckers haven't touched the PS1 games in over 20 years, if at all. I could talk about that at length, but that's a topic for another day. Money was tight for my family growing up, so video games were a major luxury for most of my youth. I'd get 1, maybe 2 games a year for my birthday or Christmas if I was lucky. But there were other ways to get a taste of a wider range of games. Demo discs introduced me to plenty of titles I otherwise never would have discovered in the wild, and rental stores much the same. Tombi, Klonoa, Daughter Phantomile, Cooler World, Toy Story 2, Bugs Bunny Lost in Time, Yu-Gi-Oh! Forbidden Memories. I got to sample so many games this way. Even better was when my old man got our PS1 Slim serviced so that we could play foreign and copied discs. So every trip to the video store made me feel like a kid in a candy shop. We also used copied discs as a form of insurance for the games we did already own. For those who weren't around in the days of the PS1, those old compact discs were fragile as hell. If you didn't care for them or store them properly and they got too scratched, there could be parts of the game that would be rendered unplayable, or worst case scenario, the game wouldn't start at all. One of those cases for me was my first copy of Spyro 2. The disc for that one eventually got so damaged to the point that the level Scorch would just never load, meaning that level and the entirety of the Winter Tundra world were completely inaccessible to me for years. That was my first experience of having the ability to play a game stripped away from me like that. I wouldn't get another copy until about 10 years later. Having access to all these games on a copied disc was nice and all, but blank CDs in a folder didn't feel like any way to maintain a game collection. So as I got older and I finally had a full-time job, one of the first things I did was hop online and pick up full box copies of all of the games I never truly owned but always wanted. I could finally indulge in all the best parts of owning physical games. Enjoying the box art and all the stuff on the back cover, seeing actual art printed on the discs, the manuals, the feeling of actually having something tangible on my shelf, not to mention the investment. I got this copy of Klonoa for $90 New Zealand back in 2014. Have you seen what this thing goes for nowadays? Insanity. I had a big emulator phase in high school where I was replaying old favorites or trying out some titles I was never able to find, but none of that could compare to actually owning these games for myself, displaying them on a shelf, and being able to actually play them on native hardware. And over the years I did the same with many other systems, PS2, PS3, Xbox 360, even picking up copies of all the DS games I sampled for myself via the R4 flash card as a poor high school student. I was ordering so much stuff off eBay that I was feverishly checking the mail every other day in anticipation for something's arrival. The mid-2010s had me on a collecting frenzy, picking up more games in the span of a few years than I did at any other point in my life. I made a tradition of hitting up our local EB Games after work once a week to both scope out new releases and hunt for some rare finds in the pre-owned bins. I'll never forget some of the best finds I had here. A DS copy of Chrono Trigger for only $20. The Last Story, one of the few remaining Wii games still on the shelf brand new since launch that I picked up in 2015 for far cheaper than they were going for online. Snagging Rhythm Heaven on a whim because it looked neat, only for it to quickly become one of the more sought after hidden gems on the 3DS. I was there so often I became fast friends with one of the clerks, who's still a close friend of mine all these years later. My friend group also used to go on some mini road trips around the surrounding towns, making a day of going somewhere nice for lunch, enjoying a local recreational activity, and visiting pretty much every second-hand store and game shop in the region to see what we could find. Those were some of my fondest memories in what was otherwise the worst era of my life. Whether it was buying new or finding some old gold, physical games were always an absolute joy to have. Whether it was reading through the manual on the car ride home as a kid, or the satisfaction of completing a set of a legacy series as an adult. There was almost a sport to the whole thing before you'd even popped it in your console to play it. I own several hundred games physically, and a good amount of them have a story behind them, sometimes from how I came across them from looking over shelves multiple times in a store, the ones I sunk countless hours into playing multiplayer or co-op with friends, the bittersweet ones that I associate with people who are no longer in my life, the ones I was eagerly awaiting and played well into the night on release day, the cautionary tales to serve as a reminder not to get too caught up in hype culture. There's some stuff in here that even if I found myself in financial peril, I could never bring myself to part with, since the sentimental value is worth far more than the price tag. With already very full shelves taken up with most of the stuff I already checked off my list long ago, I don't buy nearly as many new titles for the shelf as I used to. But that was a period of my life I still look back on fondly, as I'm now trying in vain to actually get through all of these games I've accrued. But if we're talking about the joy of getting together to enjoy new game releases, then we have to talk about midnight releases. When the lead up to a game's release is so colossal that select retailers would open late at night to give the fans a chance to pick up their copies right at the stroke of midnight on release day. You had certain games that had people lining up around the block for them. I didn't fully get into the series until years later, but I remember the launch events for Halo 2 and 3 in the United States in particular being so gargantuan that they made the news over here. New Zealand is the leading time zone on the planet, so when universal release dates became far more common in the 2010s, we were often the first in the world to get our hands on new releases for midnight launches. I didn't go to nearly as many of these things as I would have wanted, since my income was next to nothing until after I left high school, but these were always a great time. They petered out after a while when the pre-order numbers in my town weren't high enough to justify the operation and security costs, but I remember the last one I attended was the launch for Pokemon Sun and Moon in 2016. Now, I've had my issues with the series since it made the jump to 3D, but all the same, that was a great night. People dressed up in cosplay, bought their old games, their card binders, battled and traded with each other. You had people with thinning hair and back pain who would have been teenagers back when Red and Blue dropped, and you had parents there with their kids excited to see the next adventure. It was a congregation of many people in the community I may have passed by without a glance many times, but all together in one place for a collective interest that we could geek out with each other for a few hours before heading home. As far as midnight events go, I don't think we had any more in my town outside of the launch of the Nintendo Switch in 2017. And even from what I hear, overseas midnight releases are far less common than they used to be. Many game releases were financially doing better than ever before, but you didn't hear as many public fanfare for any releases after that point to the extent that people were going to midnight launches. If you did attend any midnight releases for a game after 2017, leave a comment and tell me which game and what the turnout was like. I'm genuinely curious. There definitely seemed to be a sea change of sorts with the release of physical media in the latter half of the 2010s. A lot of people don't remember this, but there was a brief period of time in the PS3 and 360 generation where digital games were actually selling at a lower MSRP than their physical counterparts. It made sense because you didn't have the extra manufacturing and shipping costs involved. But as digital sales increased, that whole thing silently went away. Many games started offering more pre-order incentives on digital storefronts, special edition releases for games with big boxes full of goodies became less and less common, and then you had companies like Limited Run Games and Super Rare Games gaining traction for doing physical releases of games that otherwise weren't seeing retail releases, as getting box games seemed to be becoming more and more of a novelty than the status quo. But then there was the big moment that sounded off alarm bells in my head that a change was taking place, and that was the announcement of the next generation of PlayStation and Xbox consoles offering cheaper models that came without a disk drive. And this was met with both confusion and concern. A digital-only console? Some of these games are approaching 100 to 200 gigabytes each now. That's going to hold like 5 AAA games at a time if you're lucky. Disc-based consoles were still available and the overwhelmingly preferred choice, but as incentives to buy digital increased, and even many people's movie-watching habits switched to streaming, especially over the course of the 2020 pandemic, the seeds had been planted for what came next. In recent years, physical releases for some titles had definitely been dialed back depending on the publishers. You'd get some cases like Klonoa Fantasy Reverie series which only saw English physical releases in Europe, or Fantasy Life I which only got a physical release in Japan despite releasing internationally in digital form. Some games even from big publishers like Psychonauts 2 or Alan Wake 2 released as digital-only titles, and didn't get physical releases until a year later. Perhaps to test the waters to see if they sold enough to get physical releases? But that can't be true because I'm pretty sure both of those games commercially underperformed. Either way, it started becoming clear that for many games, getting a physical release had become more geared towards enthusiast collectors than your average Joe. And whether the average Joe sees it that way or not, that's a terrible thing. With a physical copy of a game, you own it. It's yours to use as you see fit. You can play it, use it as a display piece, loan it to someone else to play it, sell it or trade it in if you're not that attached to it anymore. Or even 20 years from now, you have an inkling to pick up that game and play it again for old time's sake. Pull out your old console, put in the disc, fire it up, and have a good time. You want to do that with a digital copy of a game? Well, there's a lot more complications there. If you never actually own the game yourself, you forgot your own password or your account got hacked or banned, the storefront went offline like the original Xbox, the Wii, the 3DS, the Wii U, the Xbox 360, soon to be the PS3 and PS Vita and everything else that seems safe now because it's currently online, there's a good chance that's all going to be gone. Whether through user error or hardware failure, that stuff is more susceptible to being lost than anything on a disc. Now, as with all controversies like this one, it's come with a series of talking points that many people have latched onto as if to denigrate the idea of still collecting physical games in the current day. Even in something as transparently corporation versus consumer as you can get, you still have some human cattle choosing to side with the corporations or otherwise downplay this whole thing, to which I want to tackle here because they're really starting to get on my nerves. Point 1. Disc rot is scaremongering bullshit. I saw a post someone made saying something along the lines of, people learning about disc rot now are the same as 4th graders learning that the sun is going to explode one day, and that's about the most accurate assessment I've seen of this whole thing. Disc rot is a very real phenomenon. Due to a combination of poorly manufactured disc pressings and irresponsible storage, discs can physically degrade to the point that they're unusable. Not to be confused with the way that scratch discs are rendered inoperable. Some people for some reason have taken the existence of disc rot as meaning that there's no point in hanging on to physical games because the discs are going to start rotting and be rendered unusable in 10 to 20 years, which as far as I'm concerned is a naive thing to believe and a reckless thing to be spreading. Disc rot can and certainly will happen to every disc, much the same way everything eventually degrades just from the passage of time. But the shelf life of discs is a lot longer than scaremongers would have you believe. Existing cases of disc rot have not only been very rare, but almost universally from shoddy quality control during production, as many have reported a few prints of particular Warner Bros. Home media releases have been rendered unusable despite not being scratched. This is also something that can be more commonly observed in mass-produced general consumer CDs, so if you have any family photos from the early 2000s stored on an old CD somewhere, I'd go check them just in case. In the case of games though, take it from someone who has discs dating back to the mid-90s. Your games are going to be fine. If you're storing them properly and not leaving them face down on a table somewhere, you have nothing to worry about. Most discs are estimated to last anywhere from 80 to 100 years before degrading in any significant way by themselves. As far as degradation goes, you have a far better chance of having a disk drive mechanism, an optical drive laser, or an SSD die on you. If you take care of your discs, they will probably outlive you. Disc rot in games is overwhelmingly rare. You really don't have to be worrying about it at this point in time. Point 2. The 85% of all game sales are digital statistic is misleading. As I mentioned earlier, the advent of digital storefronts becoming easier and easier to access has seen an increasing amount of people buying their games that way, with many people I've seen saying they haven't bought any games physically since as far back as the PS3. This is an undeniable truth, but the narrative being pushed that 85% of game sales on PlayStation are digital is a deliberately curated statistic. First up, this is accounting for everything. Game sales, DLC, PS5 upgrade packs, everything. DLC is the obvious one. Unless a Game of the Year edition or other special editions comes out for a game, DLC are going to be digital purchases whether you have a disc or not. That's an inevitability. The game sales one is definitely a lot more sneaky though, because this accounts for all games. This includes indie games, which should go without saying overwhelmingly do not get widely available physical releases, if at all. Especially when you get some of the super big releases like Hollow Knight Silksong, which sold so spectacularly well that each digital storefront it was available for purchase on kept crashing on launch day. That's not expected to get a physical release until later this year, and I can guarantee most of the people who already bought it won't be double dipping to get the physical copy. It'll largely come down to people who don't already own it, or said from the beginning that they'll be buying it physically the moment it releases. Like me. So that's an already skewed statistic there. You also have the dreaded gun and ball gamers, which, as the stats have shown from a lawsuit from a few years ago, and even the top sellers page most months, make up the overwhelming majority of the console audience. There are literally millions of guys out there who buy every new console just to play the new FIFA, the new 2K sports game, the new Call of Duty, or play Fortnite 8 hours a day while their bored girlfriends sit next to them while rolling their eyes between doom scrolling on Instagram reels. These games are so disposable to them that most of those sales are digital because they don't need that storage space for anything else. Another one comes out next year, they'll just delete the old one. If you account for non-annual games that actually have physical releases, you get a much larger skew of people buying physical versus digital, particularly with actual first-party titles and legacy franchises. Digital sales are absolutely higher than they've ever been before, but this statistic is a half-truth. And the narrative it's being used to push would not stand up to scrutiny if we were evaluating purely physical versus digital sales of games that actually got a release in both formats. It's just like that statistic from years back that claimed more adult women were playing video games than men, which was also skewing the numbers because the majority of those were mobile gamers. And, I'm sorry, no. Playing Candy Crush and Clash of Clans when you're on the toilet doesn't make you a gamer. You're on the same level as the dudes who play the same gun and ball games every year. Accept it. Point 3. PlayStation discs are not internet downloads. This is the one that pisses me off especially because it's one of the most common ones being regurgitated by people who don't know what they're talking about. The same kind of window lickers who think games are manufactured in the back rooms of your local GameStop and think Naughty Dog still makes Crash Bandicoot games. Since the PS3 and Xbox 360, there's been the ongoing conversation about how the implementation of patches, DLC, and downloads in general have rendered the idea of owning a physical game moot. Sure, you have the game there, but it's busted without the day one patch and incomplete without the DLC, right? Well, yes and no. This is where buyer smarts comes into play. If you truly want every last bit of content on a disc, your best bet is to get re-releases of certain games like Greatest Hits or Game of the Year editions, or even next-gen ports, which come with the most up-to-date build of the game and all of the DLC. But in most cases, this whole thing is wildly exaggerated. Most games you buy for a platform that has long lost its online services can be put in a console and played from start to finish. Patches being outright required to finish a game or fix downright game-breaking bugs are in the overwhelming minority, the worst-case scenario. In most cases, you just have a slightly less refined version of the game that still plays just fine, but that's not what this is entirely about. The real controversy is with games starting in the PS4 and Xbox One generation. A big issue with the Blu-ray discs the PS3 used was that the optical drive on the console was very slow, which meant reading the discs took a lot longer, and as such PS3 versions of multi-platform games usually ended up with the longest load times, among a bevy of other issues completely unrelated to the disc format. Something that was done to alleviate this in some later gen PS3 games and adopted as a standard in the following generation was installing data off the disc and onto the console's hard drive to massively reduce load times. This for some reason has been interpreted by a lot of people as being the same as Nintendo Switch 2's game key cards. The disc just being a license to use the game and the data is downloaded online. You don't truly own the game and that disc is just worthless.
What are you, fucking stupid?
That's not how this works. Yes, patches and updates are still a thing, but that long wait when you first put a disc in your console isn't downloading it from the internet, it's installing it off the disc. You absolute spoon. If you disconnect from the internet and slot the disc in, it's still going to install, because the data is on the fucking disc. Why do you think Red Dead Redemption 2 and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth came on 2 discs? One to use as a download key and the other to use as a frisbee? It's an install disc. If the industry collectively decided they all weren't going to bother doing anything more than a license in a box to download a game, then they all would have cut costs by ditching discs in favor of codes in a case 13 years ago. Now don't get me wrong, there absolutely are games out there where the discs or cartridges don't contain the full game and require a download, and those are usually stated as such on the box. Games like Oblivion Remastered, The Outer Wilds 2, Doom the Dark Ages, Assassin's Creed Shadows, all of those are games where they require an additional download to function, and they are like that by design because the publishers cheaped out and didn't want to pay for an additional disc to store the remaining data. They absolutely deserve the criticism they get. There's also partial cases like Spyro Reignited Trilogy, famously having been rushed towards the arse end of its development to the point Year of the Dragon had to be outsourced to another studio, and even after getting delayed, the disc release only included Spyro 1, with the other two needing to be downloaded. Then there's the more infamous examples which don't state any of this on the case but have been well documented, perhaps most notably Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5. The disc contains about 5 GB worth of data, with the rest of the game and a metric buttload of patches required for it to even function. When you find yourself without internet and when the PSN eventually goes down, those discs are all functionally very expensive coasters. This does not account for the vast majority of games out there though. Most of the games you've bought will still work just fine. Try it yourself. Disconnect from the internet, insert a game with a fresh install, and take it for a spin. I guarantee the majority of what you have is still playable from start to finish. If you want to know more, go check out the socials for Does It Play. They do a great job documenting the sort of thing from first-hand testing and inquiring with developers about games being all on disc. Now, I'll be completely transparent here. I do most of my gaming on PC nowadays. Online features without a subscription, emulation is easier than ever, the stuff you can do with modding is insane, and Steam has a massive library spanning multiple generations and regularly has sales. Plus I keep up with a lot of the indie scene, which primarily stick to PC and are usually smaller titles that can't afford to get a physical release without a special deal or a publisher attached. There's plenty of games I've owned physically over the years that are bought again on Steam for ease of access and to have them performing and looking at their best. By the same token, there's also plenty of games I've owned digitally for years that eventually get physical releases by means of short print retailers, like super rare games and limited run games, or even more long-term storefronts like Fangamer and I Am 8-Bit. I've happily double-dipped to get physical copies of certain games because even if I predominantly play them on Steam, I like having a copy to share with my friends, do a quick replay for an all-achievement run, or just display on my shelf as a neat collector's item you won't just find sitting around your local retailer. For instance, DCell recently announced that Unbeatable would be getting a physical release soon to coincide with their 2.0 release, and I liked that game enough that I'll happily be grabbing another copy of it just to have it physically. Understand I'm not against the concept of buying and playing games digitally. That'd be stupid. There are plenty of titles out there that to this day can only be bought digitally, and I believe if you think them not being available physically means they're not worth playing at all, then you're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. What I advocate for, however, is there being a choice. That choice became a lot more difficult for many in my corner of the world as EB Games closed its doors earlier this year. The only retailer we had left that specialised in games and actually accepted trade-ins, while just about everywhere else carried them as an afterthought. Well, even then they were kinda pushing it since half the stores were Funko Pops and other pop culture tat. And now you have Sony ceasing disc production in 2 years, which considering they're one of the primary distributors of Blu-ray discs is likely going to have a downstream effect. Xbox probably aren't going to keep doing discs, a lot of movies and TV shows will likely stick to streaming, and Sony owns Crunchyroll now so your anime Blu-rays are likely not long for this world. And it sucks to see. Many people were sold convenience over ownership in the age of streaming, and now it's all coming to a head to bite the people who still care about that sort of thing. Make no mistake, this is PlayStation's equivalent of Xbox's appearance at E3 2013. A brand that was once on top of the world pulling a move that was so anti-consumer that even trying to backpedal on the aftermath irrevocably destroyed their public image and their player base along with it. Even with genuinely good features like Game Pass, Quick Resume, and the best backwards compatibility of the current console lineup, Xbox is a shell of what it once was. Though even without that E3 debacle, they've not exactly been doing anything to help themselves these last 13 years. They have all the money in the world, but no sense. And even if we put all the optic stuff aside for a moment, real talk, the PS5 has fucking sucked as far as first-party titles goes. Of all of PlayStation's previous systems, this has got to be the most pathetic library we've ever had, even accounting for the former exclusives that got ported to PC or went multi-platform. The PlayStation 3 had a better library after 3 years than the PS5 does after almost 6. I own 29 physical PS5 games at time of writing, and can you guess how many of these I can only get on PS5? 3. Astrobot, the Demon Souls remake, and Ghost of Yotei. Of the PS5 exclusives I've played, the only one that I truly walked away from incredibly satisfied with was Astrobot. And as much as I like that game, it is not worth buying a whole console just to play it. It's basically a 3D Mario game in all but name, and I wouldn't even rate it above Super Mario Odyssey or the Galaxy duology. I love having games physically for many reasons. Having something I like in tangible form is an assurance that it's always there and easy to use. The peace of mind that I'm always able to play it for as long as I have a functioning console. That I have it there as a conversation piece, as something I can tell an inquiring friend all about, recommend it to them, loan it to them, maybe even make them want to get a copy for themselves. And more than anything, thinking about the future. 10 years can go by like a flash, especially as you get older. and I found myself becoming nostalgic for things I never could have imagined when they were still new. Recounting a lot of my escapades building my collection for this video was very nostalgic for me because a lot of that was 10 years ago now. 2016 doesn't seem as long ago now as 2006 did to me at the time. There's also the next generation to account for. There's games I've played like Bugsnax, Little Gator Game, Tinykin, A Hat in Time, all titles I played digitally initially that I grabbed physical copies for, not just for me, but because they're games I'd love to show my future kids someday. And I think that would mean so much more if I could do it by physically handing them a case. Now, I'm not going to be like one of those nihilistic cynics who thinks there's no good games worth playing anymore, because that couldn't be further from the truth. Sure, the AAA space is in pretty dire straits with its 5+ year dev cycles and visually all looking the damn same, with their Unreal Engine 5 photorealism, magenta lighting and cinematic over-the-shoulder bollocks, but there's still gold in them hills for those willing to check out the stuff in the AA and indie space. However, I can confidently say that Sony doesn't have anything they could put out that would make the prospect of a digital-only console look appealing to me. Naughty Dog hasn't shown off anything I've been remotely interested in since Uncharted 4, Insomniac Games are a Marvel sludge production line now, Japan Studio is dead and buried, and Team Asobi could put out their best Astrobot game yet, and that alone would not be worth the investment. I may have been raised on PlayStation systems, but I'll always stand by what's best for consumer rights over blind brand loyalty. If I want a purely digital ecosystem, I'm sticking to PC, because that's an open platform with multiple storefronts, the capacity for emulating older games I otherwise can't procure, and a ton of other uses outside of gaming. If I want to keep up a physical collection, Nintendo seems to be remaining dedicated to that, and they're actually still releasing first-party titles worth a damn, which goes a long way. I'm still side-eyeing them over the game keycard stuff though. I'm not paying a cent for one of those, and if they someday decide they're also abandoning physical, then they'll get dropped just as hard. And let's be crystal clear here, this is as much a power move as it is a cost-saving measure. With IRL retailers and second-hand sales out of the picture, Sony has a monopoly on how much they can charge for their games, and full control over the contents. If something in a game gets removed, like licensed music after the rights expired, or something getting altered or even censored in a patch, you can't just wipe the update data from the console and play the vanilla game off the disc. You'll play the game exactly how they want you to. And if you think removing physical releases from the equation will bring down the price of digital, it won't. These companies have all been charging the same as, and sometimes more, than what the physical releases are going for on their digital storefronts, because they can. And when buying digital is your only option in a closed console ecosystem, there's nothing you can do about it. If you're someone who predominantly plays on PS5 and truly cares about physical releases, you have no reason to hang around for the PS6 and beyond, outside of unapologetically whipped brand loyalty. Switch to a different platform. Focus on the games you still haven't gotten around to. Cancel your PlayStation Plus subscription to send a message. Just do anything but letting FOMO and Stockholm Syndrome lead you to settling for an entirely digital platform with a closed ecosystem because you're overly attached to a brand and your trophy collection. You deserve better than that, and Sony doesn't deserve you.